Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to episode 6 of 584 Vetoes, the podcast that complains about healthcare issues, personal and professional. I'm Tom Church.
I'm Danny Heil.
Today, we're trying to figure out a healthcare agenda for the incoming Republican administration, that's President-elect Trump, and a unified Republican Congress.
Unified might be a stretch.
Unified, I mean, they have a majority in both houses.
They're majority Republican, but unified. I think that's
okay. Fair. Much. You know what? That's good. That's a good note. Before that, Danny, it's been a little bit. How you doing? How's your exploded shoulder?
I'm all right. I had my shoulder surgery on Christmas Eve, which is a great time to have shoulder surgery with 2 kids.
Yeah.
But it is all one piece again, so my shoulder labrum is back together.
How
was your ACL? As we're just old men complaining about our ailments these days.
Mostly healed. Haven't started jumping yet, but I can fly a plane, and so that's all I care about. That's okay.
Any interesting things with flying planes these days, Thomas?
Absolutely. I got my airplane instrument rating, and I'm looking up at the sky, looking at slight cloud tops that are that high that I could punch through later today if I can get a plane. So we'll see how that goes.
Because for the last year and a half, you were like, every time you would see a cloud, you would curse at it because it would preclude you from flying. Yeah.
No, now though, legal to fly blindly in the clouds on an instrument flight plan and other things. FAA, don't quote me on these things. Anyway, no, we're that's personal life. Great. Professionally, it's actually kind of an interesting, fun time. I think I'm excited. We got on the 20th, Donald Trump takes over for his second non-consecutive term, and I'm not going to say healthcare. It looks like they're going to do one big old reconciliation bill that's going to try and cover like everything, Danny. Border security, energy, the big one, the expiration of the TCJA, the Trump tax cuts at the end of this year. It looks
TCJA.
I'm saying it really quickly. It's tough. But it's TICJA. And it looks like they'll probably extend all these tax cuts and I don't know, maybe use a current policy baseline and spend lots of money. Or really not bring in more revenue.
Thomas, you're conservative. They're not spending money. They're just taking less of people's money.
They're taking less of it. But what they're not, there hasn't been really clear to me that there is a health policy agenda. And so that's what I want to talk through today is what are some ideas? Not like big, let's get rid of the employer-sponsored, insurance exclusion and start everything over. No. What are the options that are like on the agenda that could be decided, that have to be decided, and then maybe some stretch goals to go through. So what do you think about that?
Love it. But we're not going to get rid of ESI.
I don't think we're going to put it in a reconciliation bill like this month. You know what I mean? I don't think that's happening.
I mean, it would serve as an amazing pay for. It would pay for a lot.
It's true. $400 billion or so, something
there might
like
be, 80% of Americans that would object, but
Right. I don't see that happening. All right, so I'm going to split this up into options that affect the Affordable Care Act, options that affect the private health insurance market, or really the employer market. Let's go that way. Medicaid and Medicare. So first up, the ACA. This is one that is going to have to be decided, and it's the big one. We've talked with lots of people about it. We've mentioned it before. It's the temporary, I say in air quotes, expansion of premium tax credits and the lowered required contribution amounts expiring at the end of 2025. Danny, what was the off the top of our head if they were to extend it for out 10 years? It was something like $240 billion.
I think CBO had it at 335. The President Biden administration they had it at a lower number, but the CBO came in at 335.
Okay, so if this just is allowed to expire, 2 things. One, we look at this and go, okay, it gave premium subsidies to Affordable Care Act enrollees above 400% of poverty, which we think was not exactly, if you're talking about well targeted, you're going up the income ladder pretty high at that point.
Yeah, just for like the math of it, like you had people earning $200,000 a year, family of 4, that would qualify for subsidies. So,
right, not the original intention of the Affordable Care Act, I think. Yeah, but there's the other part, which is the required amount you're required to pay for your premiums. Starting, it went up to 8.5% of income for those who at the 8.5,
9.5, I think.
9.5. Oh, sorry, we're down here.
Yeah, exactly.
There it is.
How could you forget that, Thomas? We spent the better part of like 25% of our life looking at the Affordable Care Act.
I try not to think about it that hard. But right now, at the low end of the income spectrum, you can have 0% required, and so that'll bump back up to like a little above 2%. Is it 2.1? Tell me.
It's like a little bit over 2, yeah, because there's like these weird factor adjustments that go in place each year. But yeah, effectively, the way ACA works is it used to the premium is set at whatever the standard premium is for your area, your geographical area, and that's the second cheapest silver plan, and then that's the maximum amount of the subsidy. But then individuals are required to contribute a certain amount of their income, and that's where the 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 9.5% goes into it. Um, and so
See,
yeah,
my dog is set away. Your dog is hanging out. I love that.
Chesterton is has not got the walks that he normally gets with my shoulder
Ah,
injury,
yes,
so he's a little more
yes,
feisty these days. But yeah, but he's very much opposed to extending the ACA.
as he should be.
Yeah, and I would note that, I mean, technically the Republicans don't have to do anything. The Republicans can just say, "Hey, we're not extending it, and it's just going to go away." I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think there was already Murkowski, senator from
Yep.
Alaska, right? She's already come out and said, "I want to extend it." So I think they're going to have to do something on that front.
All right. So first priority, first preference here is just to let this expire and go away at the end of the year. Here, how about this for like a second least bad option? The expansion above 400% of poverty, those premium tax credit extra support, let that expire, but keep the slightly lower required contribution rates for premiums for the below 400% of poverty. I mean, if you're gonna have to do
You're not going to
something,
save much money though, right? It's still going to
I
cost
know.
a lot of money if you continue to keep the really low required contribution rates, right? Because going above 400% of poverty, there's still the math of, well, you still have to contribute a lot, and the reality is most people above 400% of poverty have ESI, right? So it's a very small group of folks that you'd be
I
hitting by
understand,
that,
but you said
and be
they
still
might
very
have to do
costly.
something. So, like, what's the compromise that allows us to at least not just fully extend them? And like, that's one. It's better targeted than, oh, let's extend it for another year and keep it up. For those people above that. Uh,
Uh, then at that point, you're haggling over pennies
I
while
agree.
the
I don't
the
want it to happen, but we
Yeah,
gotta
yeah.
we
I,
gotta
I
provide
think I
some
think it's
sort of
better to
option.
think more about, are there ways to make the ACA better with that money, without just like fully on extending it, right?
Hmm.
And like just being wedded to. I mean, let's be very clear here how this came about. This was in the depths of COVID, March 2021. Democrats extending this for 2 years, or creating this for 2 years, and then in the Inflation Reduction Act, extending it for 2 more years. So this wasn't something that was, deliberated in any meaningful sense of the word. It was just Democrats looking for an opportunity to expand the Affordable Care Act in any way they could. They were willing to spend a lot of money, so they said, "Well, we're already spending 2 trillion. What's another couple trillion on top of that, or a couple hundred billion on top of that?" Right? So for the Republicans just to say, well, we got hurt back in 2017 when the ACA, when we tried to repeal and replace, and so now the answer is just, well, let's just suck it up and just do it. I think there are better ways to think about it, which is the ACA has failed to deliver on the promises of its creators. If you go back to the original purpose of the program, it was supposed to lower costs. It was supposed to provide coverage that was meaningful coverage, and you look at actually what people get. And outside of the fact that most people are on these cost sharing subsidies, if you don't have those, it's a not generous plan at all. You have very high out of pocket payments. It's something where people wouldn't be buying but for the subsidies. And so if Republicans want to, if they say, well, we can't get rid of the ACA, they should be aiming to make the ACA actually better. And just expanding subsidies doesn't do that.
Does I just thought of this. If Republicans look at the reconciliation and the tax cuts and say, all right, let's use a current policy baseline, which, assumes that this is all going away and they don't have to pay for $4 trillion in tax cuts,
Yeah.
do they get some savings by allowing the temporary expansions to expire?
Yeah, but I'm actually not. I mean, the current policy baseline thing is just like a rhetorical argument that, we're not actually spending this money. This is just in, right. It's not actually, when it comes to like the Byrd Amendment, which is sort of what governs how reconciliation rules
Reconciliation
have to
works,
go.
yeah.
It's pretty much current law. How it's written is beyond 10 years, you're not allowed to add to the deficit by one penny through that legislation.
Hmm.
And so,
And you
regardless of
can't
what
touch
they
Social
do,
Security, right?
and
A
yeah, you
couple
can't touch
others.
Social Security, and there's like a bunch of other sort of random rules. And so what they can do in this space is, well, so because it's already expiring, it's an extra cost. Extending it beyond 10 years is something that is just like essentially impossible with the budget math, right? Because they'd have to find something else to cut beyond 10 years to pay for this. And I can't imagine Republicans going that far, right? So it's going to be a temporary extension, if anything. And that goes with, like, all tax legislation and everything in reconciliation, essentially, because they're planning on spending a lot of money. So then they'll come back and say, well, if you do current policy, this isn't that expensive at all. But I don't think we should give into that game to some extent, right? Because then, like, come 2033, you're like, oh, well, Social Security, and the current policy baseline is we continue to spend this money on Social Security and Medicare, even though the trust funds have gone bankrupt, right? So you end up with this, we already sort of bake into the fact that we're giving Congress really bad incentives to spend more money and raise deficits, and just to give them an out of saying, "Oh, I'll just use current policy," is just more of an unsustainable trajectory.
Okay, so let it expire is our recommendation here. Speaking of the ACA and trying to make it better, here's option number two. And this is something that you and I have started to score and model and are at a pitch, and we think it's a decent idea. Make all high deductible plans
I'm
high
not doing
deductible.
any pitching right now with my shoulder, but
That's true. On the ACA marketplace exchanges, HSA eligible. Now, this is that weird glitch we were talking about a while back where we realized, wait, why aren't there more people HSA eligible on ACA individual exchanges? They have high deductible health plans, really high deductible health plans. And it turns out it's because to be HSA eligible, you have to both meet the deductible requirement, it's got to be above a certain amount, and your maximum allowable out of pocket expense amount can't be too high either. And ACA plans, their MOOP, their maximum out of pocket payment, grows at premiums, which is faster than inflation, which is what regular HSA high deductible health plans grow at. And so more and more people are no longer eligible for HSAs, even if they take high deductible health plans in the ACA.
yeah, just as a background to this, I mean, back when the ACA began offering plans in 2014, and in the legislation, if you read the original Affordable Care Act, it literally says in 2014, the maximum out of pocket payments are set to be equal to the high deductible health plan limits. And so that meant that in that year, you had a lot of HSA eligible plans within the exchanges because the MOOP limits were the same. But the Affordable Care Act architects, they put in a different indexing factor. They said, we're going to grow everything by premiums instead of CPI. And so there's just been this growing gap between the two. And I've looked through the legislative language to try to find a meaningful reason why they chose that one. And it looked like sort of, well, we got to index this to something. Let's just index everything to premiums. I can actually make a case that that makes more sense than
Yeah,
the
the
high deductible health
prices.
plans, just
Yeah.
limiting them to prices, right? Like, healthcare prices rise faster. The idea that we're just going to link it to a broad based price index probably doesn't make that much sense. But it makes no sense whatsoever that we're precluding people from having access to HSAs because their healthcare plans have out of pocket expenditures that are too high. The whole idea with HSA plans is we want to encourage people to pick plans that have more out of pocket, more cost sharing, because we think it makes people more price conscious when it comes to the kind of healthcare they buy.
All right, with the provision that these numbers are early estimates and we may change them a little bit. How many people, Danny, could you make eligible using this? How many people might use an HSA, and what would it cost?
Yeah, so when we do the math on this and look back in 2023 and see what kind of plans people had within the ACA, there are about 11 million people who bought plans or have plans that had out of pocket limits above the high deductible limits, and their deductibles were sufficient to meet the definition of high deductible health plans. So the only thing that really is precluding these plans from being HSA eligible, there's exceptions to this, but broadly, it's the fact that their out of pocket limits are too high. So if you just waive that requirement and say ACA plans that otherwise meet all the requirements of a high deductible health plan, they're allowed to go on it regardless of what their maximum out of pocket payment limits are. That alone would provide access to maybe up to 11 million. There's exceptions to that, but overall, will all people choose to do it? No. And you go back to 2014 when the maximum out of pocket limits were the same, and you saw about 10% of folks actually choosing plans that were HSA eligible. And so I think realistically, right now, it's like only 3% of people choose plans that are HSA eligible within the Affordable Care Act. You can bump that up to like 10%. Will they all contribute to HSAs just because they have those plans? No, but they'll at least have access to them. And one of the things that I think is important is why are we having anyone with an ESI plan? Nearly everyone has access to at least one HSA offering. And with the ACA, that's just not true. For most folks, that there might be one plan that doesn't meet their needs otherwise that has HSA eligibility, and then there's a bunch of plans that should but they don't because of the MOOP limits. And so this is a way just to afford them more choice. And it's not a life changing type thing, right? It's a very marginal incremental reform But the argument against it, you kind of have to say, well, it's going to cost a little money because you will get some people who take pre-tax dollars and put it in an HSA, and that's a little less money for the government. And but when Tom and I run these numbers, it's something like 1.7 billion over 10 years. And as you recall, it's to extend the ACA temporary expansions. It was 335 billion. So we're talking about a magnitude of order difference. Two magnitudes of order difference. Yeah.
Multiple.
Two. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, that number still seems high to me, but we got to dive into this
Tom
some more.
Tom quibbles with this number because we're being conservative and we're assuming that the average contributor is going to contribute as much as someone with an ESI plan that has an HS that contributes to an HSA, and that's probably an aggressive assumption. But we're also just estimating that only 8-9% or 10% of folks are going to actually choose these plans, and it's possible it's more. So there's we
All
can
right, there's some
we can
wiggle room.
quibble.
That's fine. Yeah. All right, we're gonna get into like splitting into private market, but still related to ACA. I don't know that we need to go into lots of detail on this, but I like the idea of getting rid of the ACA rule that said no more new physician-owned hospitals. I think I don't know that justification is there. That seems more like a special interest handout. We can how about we get rid of that because we need more hospitals and let physicians make their own practices and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's something where you're not going to get that many hospitals afterwards immediately showing up,
No,
right? But over like the course of
I'll
10,
take
15
anything.
years,
Yeah, take it with what you take what you can
yeah, and,
get.
and this is, I mean, really the case was that hospitals were bought off in 2010 when the ACA was being passed, and they said we'll ban physician-owned hospitals in exchange for you at least not vocally objecting to the Affordable Care Act, and it was a very political thing and really tough to make. I mean, the argument is that well, if you have physicians owning hospitals, they're gonna refer all of their patients to the hospitals that they have a stake in, and you're like, but yeah, but there's as we had when we talked to
Lawson.
Lawson a few weeks ago, the reality is there's bad incentives throughout the system, and there's all sorts of issues with people having conflict of interest, and you got to weigh the good and the bad. And the bad here is that you have fewer hospitals than the others would because you have this whole group of folks who are banned from owning hospitals, banned from building new hospitals.
Mhm. All right, good. I like that you're still on board with that one. We enjoy the idea of hey, right now you can't use your health savings account, tax preferred dollars, to pay for direct primary care memberships. I want to see more of those, and I think one impediment to that is not being able to use tax advantage dollars to pay for that. So, good with that still, Daniel?
I'm good with that. I do think that the more laws that go into promoting DPC, the more we're going to find folks that are vehemently against DPC,
Sure.
particularly insurers, right? Like insurers are look at DPC as this is a group of doctors who can make my clients, my consumers much more expensive because all of a sudden this DPC doc says, oh yeah, you have some sort of injury and yeah, I'll refer you to get an MRI done or whatever, and then all of a sudden a generous PPO is paying more out of pocket. Right. And so there is a case that right now insurers look at DPCs as, this cute little side thing that like doesn't really affect their bottom line. But if you all of a sudden have laws that do more of it, you're going to find more people object. And I'm not saying we should stop doing it. We should just be, mindful of, some of the politics of it.
So let's fix that problem when it comes, but in the meantime, let's give people more access and better quality by giving them more
Well,
options.
the aim is you got to just do a bunch of stuff at once while insurers aren't paying attention, right? And
There you
then
go.
you get
There
it
you
all
go.
into law. Yeah.
I'm hoping the new Trump administration revisits its short-term limited duration plans. Again, not a end all be all, but nice to have more options for people. Of I just need short term. I want to write a short policy that isn't crazy expensive. That doesn't have all the other requirements that other health insurance plans have. That you have to cover all these other things that get really really expensive. As opposed to I just need a little bit for right now at this amount, and then I'll figure out insurance after that.
Yeah, this is like, the first Trump administration did a lot of things sort of behind the scenes on making marginal improvements to people's health care. And most of these things kind of went by the wayside the moment the Biden administration showed up, and they quickly got rid of the short-term duration plans and other ones like it. And so yeah, I would imagine these are type of things that you'll have folks pretty quickly switching up the Federal Register again and putting in these policies back in place.
Next up, I want to bring back the push for association health plans. Again, more options. This is the idea that business groups or similar industries, or you could think of like an insurance of rideshare employees that are, independent contractors banding together because they're in a similar position, all the rest of it, to buy insurance instead of going on the individual market. You get a little bit more what buying power. Just again, I just why not allow these things to happen? And I
The
think
insurers also don't like this one too much.
the
The
insurers don't
insurers,
like it, but
yeah,
but and the
there
Trump
is
administration
the
pushed this, and it
yeah.
got pulled back because
Mhm.
on the judicial side because I think it wasn't specific enough, or it was. I didn't love the reasoning, and I hope that they
Mhm.
revisit and fix that, and at least start experimenting with it. Again, these
Yeah.
things, let's experiment with them and
I mean,
see
the
how they
argument,
change prices.
the potential argument, like the good economic argument, is that when you have current ESI plans with its one employer, it's pretty easy to charge everyone in the same company the same premium because they kind of look alike, right? So it's easy to determine the risk pool and what the actual risks associated with that group. If you start having these plans that have a bunch of different type of people in them because they, you have just you're no longer looking at one business, you have multiple types of folks across a variety of different industries potentially, then the insurers get really concerned that it's going to be really hard to price these things. No, like I'm like, yeah, but you can do that, and like there's ways to solve that, and ultimately giving people more choice is a good thing, right? So I think unambiguously it's a good thing. I think it's just something where again, healthcare's always got a ton of different folks who it's a lot of moving parts, and all those parts are trying to protect their bottom line. And this is one case where you could see some really weird effects, particularly in the short term, as people are trying to figure it out.
Let's switch over to Medicaid. One thing that you and I have written about with Lon He, our constant co-author and buddy and coworker, is having CMS expand access to waivers, make them a bit more flexible, make them a bit more secure, especially in the long term. Once granted, 15 or 11, 1115 waivers and 1332 waivers, so that you can play with Medicaid options, with ACA options. Right now, there's these restrictions, Danny. You can probably walk through of like, if you want to get a waiver, you have to meet these things. And we'd like to play with a little bit more, especially you can't add it all to the budget immediately. Maybe if you can show Danny over a couple years, you get back to, costless. What do you think?
Yeah, I would be surprised if the Trump administration would support something like that. I do think particularly in 1332 waivers, there's the guardrails. And the guardrails, there's these four different rules of what any sort of waiver has to do. And it has to like maintain the existing coverage, and it has to not add to the federal deficit. And there's a couple other ones in there. And the Trump administration took a pretty flexible view of this, the first Trump administration, of well, we're going to define coverage pretty broadly in terms of it's not if more people are insured, that counts as meeting the guardrail. The Biden administration said, wait, it's got to meet exactly the ACA definition of coverage. And there was legal debate over whether or not the Trump's 1332 waivers went too far. I think I don't think you'd have the courts pushing back too much. Although with like Loper, it's possible the courts say, well, no, we're going to interpret it ourselves, and it doesn't seem that way, right? So it's possible that you really will need congressional action to actually move these forward. But I think the case to make to the left and the right is waivers are good. You go back to like pre-welfare reform in the 1996, and the idea of welfare reform really began with a bunch of different state experiments in terms of how to deliver cash welfare to folks. And in the same way here, finding better ways for delivering healthcare to folks is a good thing. And you have states right now experimenting with public option plans that I'm not a big fan of, and I don't think they're going to work very well. But I'm excited to see what's happening with them, and it's fun to research them and see. Yeah, they're not working as well as the people
It's
supported,
fallen
right?
short a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, they've
Yeah.
fallen short. What do we? The title of our paper was "Broken Promises," something like that. And so, like Colorado is operating under a waiver, a 1332 waiver, and so I certainly hope the Trump administration doesn't come in and say, "Well, let's get rid of these 1332 waivers." And I think the argument to make to the left is let's codify these in the laws and give states some more autonomy over really how these waivers operate. And the reason why this is necessary is back in 2021, the Biden administration came in and took a waiver that had already been granted to the state of Georgia away from them and said, no, we're going to revisit this. And they actually used the expanded ACA tax credits as the way to do this. They said, well, once with the expansions, we don't think you're going to meet the four guardrails. And so we can go and revisit this. And it got held up in court for years, and Georgia never got to experiment. And that's bad for Georgians, and that's bad for Americans that we weren't able to see the little different changes that Georgia wanted to try out. And So yeah, so it's a good example of where I think left and right, they both have these ideas. Some are really bad ideas. And we don't want to experiment on all 50 states, but if one state wants to give it a try, I think we should be affording them as much flexibility as possible, because ultimately that's how you get good public policy.
Yeah. All right, this one's a stretch. But
These are
I'm
all stretches, Thomas.
they're all stretches, but, some are more stretchier than others. That would be to
Elastic.
revise elastic revise long run, the like, in the long run, Medicaid cost sharing for the ACA expansion population. Now, when you think of ACA expansion population, you think of, all right, great. We need, well, not the expansion population, the ACA. You think of, okay, low income people, especially families who need health insurance coverage. And the ACA expansion, especially for Medicaid, yeah, for Medicaid people was, all right, let's add single working individuals to Medicaid coverage and pay 90% of the cost. Now,
ABODs,
ABODs.
able-bodied adults without dependents.
There you go, ABODs. And I mean, Medicaid generally pays between what is it, 50 and
50 to
70,
80%, depending on
50,
the
yeah,
state's
up
FMAP.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now they're paying 90% for ABODs, for able-bodied adults without dependents. And that is out in perpetuity. I think it's time to revisit that a little bit, especially as costs continue to rise and coverage. What do you think? I mean, I know it's not likely, Danny, but
No, well, I
should it
mean,
just bump down? Like, what would you bump it down to?
yeah, well, I mean, so the Affordable Care Act, the reason why they put it at 90% is because they understood that they needed to get states to buy into it, right? That it's expensive adding new Medicaid folks. And this was a whole group of folks that weren't covered under any state's Medicaid program, or very few states.
Why didn't it sunset after
And
10
so
years? Go back to regular, Medicaid
because you
matching
had a
up.
bunch of states who said, we think you're going to take this away from us, so we're not going to expand, right? Like that's
Right.
literally the argument people made, while some states didn't expand. They said, well, we no, you actually think we're exposing ourselves to future liabilities if you switch the FMAP. So to some extent, the left needed to commit that no, this is going to be in perpetuity. You're going to get this forever, in order to encourage states to go on and do it. Now, like the Supreme Court, had a big role in this, because the Supreme Court came out and said initially it was going to be very much coercive, that you have to expand your Medicaid population, otherwise your existing Medicaid dollars were going to be at risk. The Supreme Court came in and said, no, that's too coercive, violates federalism. And so ultimately, states had a lot more ability just to decline expanding their population. But the larger issue, you're right, is that now we've kind of have this reverse incentive of states don't want to expand their traditional Medicaid populations for families and children and the disabled and seniors. They do want to expand their adult population, their ABOD population, because they're getting 90 cents on the dollar from the feds. And so you do have these perverse incentives. And I'm not quite sure how you write a reform that would convince uh, states to go along with it, because every state is sort of benefiting from it. And if you say, well, we're gonna redo your FMAPs, the states that didn't expand Medicaid will probably say, yeah, let's do that. All the states that did are going to object and say, well, no, wait. And with a 3-seat majority in the House, if that, at this point, the likelihood that some California Republican says, oh yeah, we can redo the FMAPs and change who's getting the subsidies, and I'll take the political hit in California. I mean, they're not even really willing to get rid of salt, and this would affect a very large population. So my sense is you don't get much movement there, but I think there's a bigger argument here of we're using a formula, the federal matching assistant percentage, that's based from like 1950s. It's based when it was designed, not even for Medicaid, it was designed for the aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, the old welfare one that we got rid of in 1996. And it really hasn't changed much. It's a function of whatever the state's per capita income is. And so you go back and you say, well, this is a policy that's 70 years old. At some point, we need to revisit it, right? But you can apply that to a whole swath of the federal government's existing plans, right? So much of it was built out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we haven't really updated these things since.
All right. Let's go over to Medicare. I My goodness, we have to revisit. We have to revisit the Inflation Reduction Act's negotiations for prescription drug prices. We have to. Is it going to happen, Danny?
I'm actually skeptical that this administration doesn't want to double down on some of these things. The income administration won't double down on some of these things. Right at the
Why?
end of the first Trump administration, there was some talk in the administration that they were going to actually push for pretty significant price regulations. So I imagine you're not now. Will you get an expansion? Probably not, right? And What we've talked about before, some of the work I've done with John Cogan and Casey Mulligan shows that there's probably not a whole lot of revenue gains there. So you don't really want to expand it. But the idea that we're going to eliminate it seems like a stretch. That being said, the CMS administrator, which is going to be Dr. Oz in a few days, or if he gets confirmed, uh, they have immense discretion in how that program looks and operates. And it's very much a black box in terms of what they ultimately conclude is the right price to charge or to pay, I should say. And that's very unclear what, Dr. Oz thinks about these things. So, I mean, the nomination hearings should be interesting if we get a question in on what his view of how these things should be operating.
I am looking forward to that as well.
I
What
didn't say
else
I was looking
on
forward to it. I said that
Yeah.
would be interesting.
What else on Medicare? Medicare site neutral payments. We got to cut some Medicare spending. It seems crazy.
You just
To
hate the hospitals that are saving lives, don't you, Thomas?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I think there's a lot of rules in there that are being taken advantage of to make a lot of extra money that maybe we don't need. Anyway, site neutral payments. I think it's pretty popular as a method of saving money.
Somewhat, it's somewhat bipartisan. I think it's an argument that there's not strict partisan lines on this, but the Federation of Hospitals and other hospitals groups object, and their argument is, well, if you start doing this, like, we're not making above high margin returns on our hospitals, and if you start adjusting payments in these really complicated ways, you're going to have consequences to some hospitals shutting down and other things, right? So I think it's something where back in like many we've tried many times, and every time there's this concern that it might be the member looks and says it might be my hospital that shuts down, it might be my rural hospital that is gone in a year from now if we do this, and I don't want to be held responsible for it. So I at the same time, I think it's probably something where if you want to save money, it's a good place to save money. And then also, again, the intuition behind it is it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to reimburse a doctor differently depending on which building he happens to be in.
Yeah. All right. How about big picture ideas that are kind of out there that aren't necessarily coming up legislatively? Here's one that a friend of ours, mutual friend of ours, I think pitched to us a little bit. We don't love con laws, the certificate of need laws that are in states. What about bumping up your FMAP percentage by a few percentage points for a few years if you repeal your con laws so that we can boost the supply
No,
of other
to be clear, our
facilities in your
friend
states?
started talking about this, and I came up with the FMAP idea. I would
Oh,
like
you
credit for
did. Oh,
this one.
you
I,
did.
I
Oh,
came
okay.
up with
I
the FMAP.
apologize.
Like, there
Okay.
were other threats being considered,
That's right.
and yeah, my thought would be the
This isn't a
FMAP
threat,
bump
it's
up.
a carrot. It's a carrot.
Um,
You guys get rid of this, and we will give you a couple more percentage points on
Yeah,
the
or
FMAP.
it's states that don't have con laws, you get an extra, X percentage
Oh, that's
points
the
on
way to
your
do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that so states that are because many states have already got rid of their certificate of need laws, right? And so you want
Right.
to make sure you're not affecting those
For
states, right?
5
So
years,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, it goes away. So once you get rid of them, you get this extra
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit
No,
for
like
5
I
years.
mean, we just talked about the Supreme Court objecting to some coercive elements of the
It's
ACA,
not
right? Like,
coercive, though, it's
is
a
it?
reward. It's a reward. You
And
don't
I
have
think
to. You
I
can
think
you
that's
can you
right,
can have
but
it.
they made so I think that's the argument that you would make, right? Is
Yeah,
that this
okay.
isn't coercive, but you could squint and say, yeah, it's kind of coercive that you're telling states they have to change their state policies in order to get it. Now, like, I mean, it's federal tax dollars. There should be an immense amount of discretion for Congress to decide how those dollars are being spent. But we are where we are.
Okay. We already talked Medicaid, restructuring Medicaid's FMAP percentages. Would love to do some sort of like BRAC commission style, like let's get together and redo this and think about it a little bit. Would love to do
I
that.
I so when Republicans love talking about the BRAC these days of like
I know.
how we can use it for everything else, and like I think I've done this rant already, but I'll rant again. Um, the BRAC worked because you didn't know if it was going to be your particular base that was going to get shut down. And if you're talking about FMAP reform or anything to save money,
You
it's
know what
very
your FMAP's
unlikely.
going to
You,
change to.
you know
Okay,
what
yeah.
your future FMAP's going to be, right? And so and this is why, like, when we talk about BRAC for like spending cuts, the majority of money being spent is going to all the districts, right? So you have a good sense of where it's going to be, that your constituents are going to be hurt by it, right? And so then the incentives change, and just ceding authority to this outside commission doesn't help you because ultimately you voted for the commission that you reasonably could have predicted was going to hurt your district. And it would be interesting to go back and look at the BRAC and whether or not members who ultimately had bases that shut down, if they were less inclined to support it. Was there somewhat writing on the wall that, yeah, I know my base is going to shut down, so I'm going to vote against this? And it just happened to be the majority of Congress, didn't fear those changes. But it's the BRAC is a BRAC type model is not the end all be all of how we
I
really
know.
change
All right,
public
fine.
policy.
It puts a picture in your mind, though. Okay, another pie in the sky idea that will make very angry many people. On one side, restructuring. We've talked about this with Lawson a little bit. Restructure Medicare's GME payments for residency slots. Again, a system that was designed back in the day, and now we spend a lot of money to really expensive med schools and like high cost areas. It's not a unified cost per per residency slot that we're sending. It's based on other formulas, and there are a lot of less expensive, really good med schools in cheaper areas of the country that we could probably reallocate and end up with more residency slots, and therefore more doctors and more primary care physicians. We actually without spending any more money.
My thought always like, how about we just like give the resident the money somehow directly? I'm not sure how that would look, and I haven't done enough research, so this is going to kind of be just me guessing. But
This is all in
uh,
service of increase the number
yeah,
of
increase the number,
residents.
but also like reduce the incentives for med schools to play games and things, right?
Sure,
Like literally be like, if I have to bring in more residents if I'm going to get the money, because otherwise some other school gets that money, right? And then
there
you
you
have an
go. Yeah,
incentive to expand your program, right? Because you get more, right? Where right now the it's such a complicated set of rules where it's essentially hospitals have just like maxed out on their number of residency slots.
yeah. All right. Lastly, actually, before that, Danny, am I missing anything else that you think? Oh, people are talking about this, or we're gonna have to make this decision this year.
No, I think we've covered far more than that. I mean, the reality is, healthcare. I forget who told us this, but healthcare is treated as a pay for on the right, typically, right? Like, there's a lot of money there, and if we're going to save money and expand, the extend
In other
TICTA or
areas, so we're
whatever,
gonna save money.
right?
Yeah,
Like, we're gonna use healthcare as the pay for, right? So, I think the challenge for people who care about this issue and want to see good public policy is really to make the case that you got to start changing the incentives in the healthcare system. That we've been talking about healthcare reform for a very long time now, and every time it kind of breaks down because we begin with this. Well, we can't increase spending on on any of these things, and meanwhile, it's we're going to actually use these Medicaid cuts or cuts to the ACA or anywhere else to pay for other things. And we're at a point now where we shouldn't be trying to pay for other things. We just need to pay for fewer things. Um, but on top of that, we end up just continuing going down further down a road of the government's taking more control of our healthcare, the incentives are getting worse, and then that begets more government control over our healthcare, right? So at some point we need to take a step back and say we're being very short-sighted here and saying that the goal of all healthcare reforms on the right needs to be to save money. It needs to be we need to improve the incentives to eventually save money. And I think healthcare folks love it. Healthcare folks get it, but there's not many conservative healthcare folks.
yeah. I'll make one last pitch for again something that doesn't immediately save money, but would change the incentives in a positive way, and that's our individual health account idea. I'll just link in the show notes the papers we've written on this. It's this we think it's a really clever idea of not forcing everyone to like move to an HSA system, but the amount you're allowed to save in a tax advantaged account is related to how big your premium is. So we want people to have lower premiums. Is kind of the long term push, and it's a little bit more cost sharing because we think it leads to good behavior. And if you do that, you can save more in a tax advantaged account. And if you really want a high premium plan that covers a lot of things and doesn't have out of pocket costs, well, you're already going to get tax advantage, so you don't get that much of one. And I hope we can keep pushing that, and in 5, 10, 40 years, we see that pass. All right, Danny, that's a pretty good rundown. I want to give a quick veto of the week from our friend Grover Cleveland, soon to no longer be the only non-consecutive president in United States history, which he's just never going to be a trivia answer ever again. But hey, how about this? May 8th, 1886. This is the beginning. I love this, Danny. It's the beginning of the pension bill rejections. This veto, what is it? An act increasing the pension of Andrew J. Hill. So he vetoes this along with others. I'm not going to give read through many of the text, but the basic summary is this: President Cleveland vetoes this bill that would have doubled the pension of this veteran because of many reasons. One, he's concerned about Congress frequently overruling the Pension Bureau's decisions. What a harbinger for the next 2 terms of him, of Congress constantly sending pension bills to increase pensions to individual pensioners. And he says, listen, the Pension Bureau is better equipped to evaluate pension claims for all these reasons. Why is Congress doing this? There's a bunch of other options there, but I think it's it's just a harbinger of what's gonna happen.
So
I
in
like
other
this.
words,
It's
he
local
was like this.
control, right?
So this is we should look at the pension bureau as really the original BRAC, that they
That's
should
right.
be deciding it. There we go. It works. I
There
withdraw
it
my
is.
previous statement. There we go.
Love that. All right. Thank you all for listening.